In this video, we're going to start putting together the bidirectional communication between the server and the client through WebSockets using socket.io. So we already have socket.io listening. If we hop open, go over to our server.js, we already are doing a io.on connection. Remember, our io comes from the invocation of the socket.io constructor, which was imported from socket.io. But we need the client. We're going to need two things. We need the client to be able to connect to socket.io, and I want to wrap socket.io in something that can be integrated with Reactive Extensions. So the architecture of this application relies heavily on Reactive Extensions, and I want to be able to use a sort of wrapper around socket.io that makes it play nicely with our Reactive Extensions, with our reactive programming. So the first step is going to be making a simple connection to the socket.io server, which might be kind of an interesting thing here because we are using WebPack to bundle our client and everything. And previously, what we did with socket.io is we requested the client from the socket.io endpoint. So the socket.io, if you recall, registers a script file on that server instance. So then on the client, we would do something like, script source equals, localhost, or whatever, socket.io, and then I think it's like socket.io.js or something like that. But we want to use Webpack to include socket.io, and in addition to that, we want it to, the inclusion of the socket.io client, we want that to be bundled into our vendor.js file, and then we want to have that be available from the application. Well, I said this before, socket.io is also distributed as a simple client that we can import from our node modules. So let's go ahead and install the socket.io client and use it on the front end. So I'm going to npm install --save socket.io-client. So it's npm install --save socket.io-client. We're going to run that. And while that runs, I want to add socket.io client to our vendor bundle for our client. So make sure every time you modify your webpack.client or whatever, you restart your server so you always have the latest configuration of your webpack configuration for your client. But for our vendor modules, I'll go ahead and include socket.io-client. In addition, we will be writing that wrapper around socket.io to make it play nicely with Reactive Extensions. So let's go ahead and install Reactive Extensions as well. So I'm going to npm install --save RxJS, and that's going to be Reactive Extensions version 5. So we can give that a sec to install. And while that installs, I'm going to also add RxJS to our vendor modules. So RxJS. So if I were to expand this file a little bit, you'll see that our vendor modules are now jQuery, Lodash, socket.io client, and RxJS. So these will be built into the vendor.js file, which will be fairly large, but it won't be, it won't change very often, which is why we did that. And as you see, we grabbed RxJS version 5.0.0 beta.3. Anyway, now that we have that, let's go ahead and make a connection to our socket.io server on our client. So to do that, I'm actually going to introduce a new file in our client, and it's just going to be our client services. So I'm going to right-click source client, new file, and I'm going to call this services.js. And our services.js file is going to contain singletons for instances of all of our sort of infrastructure. So our socket, our wrapper over the socket, as well as our stores, our playlist store, user store, and chat store, which we'll talk about in a later video once we talk about how stores relate to components and all that fun stuff. So how do we import the socket.io client? Well, it's pretty straightforward. Simply import io from socket.io-client. And this will do the same thing that we did before in the earlier video where we included the socket.io client on as a script tag, but now we've kind of put it into our build pipeline, which is pretty cool. Okay, let's go ahead and instantiate. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say export const socket equals io, but I'm going to provide a parameter to io. So let's actually talk about this line for a second. I'm exporting in a variable, a constant variable, And I'm doing this, again, because our services represent our singleton classes, our objects that kind of do all of our backend-y type stuff, including the socket. However, I'm going to provide an option to the IO constructor. I'm going to say auto connect is false. So what I'm doing here is, what we're going to be doing in the future is we're going to be doing something like create socket wrapper, and then we're going to do something like create playlist store, create user store, and create chat store, right? So we're going to create our stores here, and our stores are going to be binding to that socket. And we don't want to connect to Socket.io just yet. We want to have all of these events that are going to be bounded to using the .on event hook to be bound to Socket.io before we connect. So that's why we are creating the socket, then we tell it not to connect, and then we create all of our stores. Then in the application, that's where we actually make the connection to Socket.io. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to open up our application.js file. And after import our SCSS, I'm going to import star as services from services. So what import star as something does is it takes all the imports from, or all the exports from that module, and it brings it into this one variable, kind of like a namespace. And so you can see in our services right now we're just exporting one thing, .socket. So you'll see Visual Studio VS Code will actually pick up on that. I can say services dot, and you can see my socket right there. So the import star imports every export into that one variable. So that's pretty cool. And then I'm going to create some placeholders. So the first placeholder I'll put in is auth, which we'll work on later. The next placeholder is going to be our components, where we create all of our components. And then the final placeholder is going to be for Bootstrap. And right now our Bootstrap is simply going to be services.socket.connect. So what's happening here is we're doing all of our initialization. We are creating all of our stores. We're binding to all of the events. Then we're going to create all of our components, which are the actual bits of HTML and behavior that'll be on our page. And then at the end of that, we bootstrap the whole thing by connecting to the socket. And by doing that, everything will be registered and will be ready to finally connect to the server when that happens. But the cool thing about this is we'll actually be able to see this work already. I can say gulp dev. And again, gulp dev will start our server watch task, our server reload task, and then our server, our actual server code is going to build the client code. So on a cold boot, this sometimes takes a little bit of time, but it seems like that wasn't that bad. Now let me go ahead and pop open a Chrome window, and I'm simply navigating to localhost 3000, and come on, there you go. And let's refresh, and we're getting a problem here. Server is started on port 3000. Oops, I'm on HTTPS. We don't have HTTPS configured with our server. So let's go to HTTP localhost 3000. And what we see here is got connection from : 1, which is my my IPv6 loopback adapter. So as you see, we are connected to Socket.io. We're ready to start communicating with the server. So let's go ahead and start work on our wrapper. See, right now, I'm gonna do some stuff here. In our application, I'm gonna say playground. I'm gonna create another section, and this is just going to be sort of code that I'm gonna be writing in our application that we'll delete later, but we'll use it to test our observable socket. What I want to be able to do is I don't want to be able to just have to do services.socket on bleh data goes into like we usually do, right? What I want to be able to do is I want to say services dot and then something. In this case, I'm going to call it server, which doesn't exist yet. I want to say on money, bleh, and then I want to say subscribe, data goes into something else. So I want to wrap the socket with a class that has this on money method that will return a Reactive Extensions object that we can do all of our Reactive Extension-y type thing with, stuff with. And you'll see throughout this course a bunch of examples of how that's super helpful. And honestly, that's if you were to sum up the point of this course in one bit, that would be mostly it, how to use Reactive Extensions for our backend. So let's go ahead and start work on our observable socket. So I'm going to nuke this code for now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this in shared, because our observable socket is going to be used both on the server and the client. Remember that that socket object is very similar both on the server and the client, so we can actually write an observable socket that will work in both instances, and I think that's really cool. So let's go ahead and go into shared, and I'm going to create a new file called observable socket.js. And observable socket.js, we are going to go ahead, start by creating a class, export class observable socket. And the class is going to have a constructor that takes in, not surprisingly, a socket. And then it's going to say this socket equals socket. So this is our wrapper class. And we're going to do a lot of really fun things in this class. But in this video, I'm going to start off with some very, very simple, straightforward wrappers. So I'm going to start off by delineating a section here, and I'm going to call this basic wrappers. So we're going to have an onMoney event. An onMoney event is going to return an observable. So let's go ahead and import our observable from RxJS. I'm going to say import observable from RxJS. So we now have our observable. And I'm going to say for on, return observable from event, this socket event. So what this will do is this will do like observable from event, and then the event name, which is going to be whatever event name we are binding to in socket.io. And the from event, if you recall from a previous course, or if you're familiar with RxJS, will create an observable sequence that we can subscribe to based off an event. And it's going to find that the socket variable has a .on method, which is a common JavaScript pattern. So we're able to literally use socket.io straight from Reactive Extensions because it conforms to an API standard that Reactive Extensions understands. Then we're gonna do a wrapper around the basic on. I'm gonna do a on event callback. This is just going to invoke the basic on method. So I'm gonna say this .socket on event callback. So this is for anybody who doesn't want to receive a event stream from socket.io. They just want to invoke the on method directly. Then we're gonna also do an off event callback, which disables a callback in socket.io. In socket.io, we use off to do the opposite of on. And then we're also going to do an emit event arg. So I'm also wrapping the basic emit method. So if you recall, the emit method sends data to the server. Now, because of the way I'm going to build this class, and because of the fact we're using Reactive Extensions, we're only ever going to pass one argument to the emit method. Well, two arguments, obviously, because we have to tell it what event we're invoking, but one argument after that. So because the reason why we're doing that is so that we can play nicely with Reactive Extensions. We'll be passing sometimes more than one argument behind the scenes, but it'll be abstracted away, and we won't have to worry about that in our client code. So let's go ahead and see the observable socket in action. So if you want to take a look at the code, it's really simple right now. We're going to make this a lot cooler in a future video. Let's open up our client, go to our services, and let's create our observable socket. So in services, I'm going to say, after we import IO, I'm going to import observable socket from shared observable socket. So if you recall, that shared path or alias WebPack is pointing to this folder. So that's a WebPack feature right there. And now let's create our socket wrapper. Export const server equals new observable socket. So we're creating our new observable socket, we're calling it server, and we're passing in the socket that we created from socket.io. So now let's see it in use. Let's go ahead and jump into our application.js. And for our playground, I'm going to say services.server onMoney, and I'll say, I don't know, test. And then I'll say map D goes into D plus whoa, and then subscribe item goes into console log got item from server. Okay, so all I'm doing is I'm binding to the test event, and then I'm doing a transformation right here using RxJS. And again, I did a whole series on RxJS, and you can watch that if you want. Otherwise, if you're familiar with it, that's a basic map operation. And then I'm subscribing to the event stream and doing something with that. So now let's go ahead and modify our server so that it sends the test event to our client when it connects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the server.js. And all the way down here on our socket, on the on connection, I'm going to go ahead, I'm just going to do something silly here. I'm going to say set interval every 1 second. I'm going to say socket emit test, and then I'll add a counter too. I'll say let index equals 0. I'll say test, and then I'll pass a string argument into it. I'll say on index. So that'll go ahead and restart the server for us. So now let's go ahead and go to our browser and hit F12 to get our developer tools. Make sure we have our console open, and then let's hit refresh. So we get this. Got on index 0. Whoops, I never incremented that, did I? Let's do ++ there. And let's be sure to restart our client. So we should start, once we connect, we should start getting those messages. Got index 0, and there you go. We have now done a basic integration of Socket.io with Reactive Extensions. Let's go a little bit further. I want to do one more interesting thing in this video, and that is tracking the state of the server connection. I want to know if it's connected, disconnected, reconnecting, and how many times it's tried to reconnect. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you guys an awesome, just an awesome aspect of Reactive Extensions and why this on method is so helpful. I'm going to go ahead and introduce a couple things. First of all, let's see here. What do I want to do? I want to go ahead and create a state object in our observable socket. Then I want to create some getters. I want to say get is connected is return this state is connected. And then we'll get is reconnecting, return this state is reconnecting. And then get is totally dead is return this state, or return not this is connected and not this is reconnecting. So is totally dead means that we completely lost the connection to the server and there's no more reconnect attempts. So how do we populate these? Well, it turns out that the socket has these events. So what I could do is I could say socket on connect and then say this state is connected equals true, right? And then I can say socket on disconnecting this, or disconnect, this state is connected equals false, and so on and so on. But there's a problem here because I actually need to recreate the state every time because I don't want the old flag of is reconnecting there. So I'd have to say this state equals and then is connected true, and so on and so on, and I can do all these events. Or I can do some Reactive Extensions magic, because what if we want to add an event handler that gets invoked every time our state changes? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say this status money equals observable dot merge, and I'm going to merge this on connect, and I'm going to map that to is connected is true. And I'll talk about the syntax probably in the next video when I recap this. But for now, we'll do that, and then disconnect map is connected is false, is disconnected. Actually, we don't need to track is disconnected. That'd be silly. And then this on reconnecting map is connected is now false, and is reconnecting is true. But the reconnecting event also sends a attempt number. So I'm going to capture the variable. I'm going to say attempt, and then I'll say attempt here. And then I'll say this on reconnect failed map, and this will simply be is connected is false and is reconnecting is false. So this would be a totally dead thing. Then I'm going to go ahead and say dot publish replay and then dot ref count. And then finally I'm going to subscribe to it by doing this status dot subscribe. State goes into this state equals state. All right, I think in the next video we will discuss this code a little bit more because it might look a little intimidating to you guys, but there's a lot going behind the scenes that makes this so powerful, and we'll see you guys then.